really happy and grateful to have been given the opportunity to speak today at this conference, which is a sequel of the Pavia conference. I'd like to thank Paolo. Where is Paolo? Okay, I would like to thank Mauro, not Paolo, sorry, Mauro, Claire, Marikian, Heather, and Oksana for the great job they did organizing it. That's why Paolo did not answer, because it's Mauro. I'm a little bit jet lagged, so bear with me, please. So in broad terms, prosopography is an analytical framework, for those of you who looked up the definition this morning, used to comprehend social dynamics. It constructs a collective biography of a given population by examining the common biographical characteristics of its members. This approach offers insights into the social reality of a particular group by identifying common patterns and connections in their individual life stories. Prosopography was developed to address the lack of archival records. Yet, prosopography still remains relatively underutilized by historians specializing in the history of slavery and free people of color. This raises questions about the method's effectiveness in reconstructing the individual and collective trajectories of historically marginalized populations that were absent from the archives. My paper today will examine the feasibility and relevance of using prosopography to study populations of color, whether free or enslaved. I will first provide a brief overview of prosopography and its usage in history before examining the benefits, limits, and challenges of utilizing this method by examining, as a case study, some records that are relative to the South Carolinian enslaved and free population of color. Prosopography is a Greek compound of prosopon, person, and grapheme, description, hence describing a person. Prosopography is also referred to as collective biography. It is an auxiliary approach to historical study that focuses on finding the common characteristics of historical actors belonging to a specific group. Prosopography aims at highlighting the specific features of a social group, to study its internal dynamics and social practices, and to analyze the relationships between historical actors. Prosopography helps analyze how a social group was formed and enables to construct typologies through a form of serialization, if you will, of biographical information. Whereas biography studies the personality of individuals in their entirety, or aims at doing so, focusing on their inner and outer traits. Prosopography focuses on the external commonalities and differences between individuals within a specific population. Genealogy, therefore, only meets the expectations of someone who engages in prosopography, because by focusing on kinship and ties, and family ties and lineage, genealogy fails to highlight commonalities or differences in trajectories between individuals in a specific population. Lawrence Stone argues that the success of any prosopographical undertaking depends on the rigorous preliminary work of building up a corpus, what he calls a universe, namely a population united by common observable traits and with well-defined group boundaries. The corpus is then systematically screened using a standardized questionnaire designed to address the researcher's problem. Finally, as Stone explains, the various types of information gathered about individuals are juxtaposed and combined before being examined for significant variables, differences, commonalities, so on and so forth. Finally, collective biography or prosopography is different from microhistory. Microhistory seeks to reconstruct the collective from individual itineraries and explain social structure as the relationship between individuals. It proceeds in an inductive way by reconstructing the social reality of a group from the singular historical subjects that compose it. Prosopography, on the other hand, begins with a pre-existing group that shares commonalities. It then deconstructs the group in question before reconstructing it the social category, okay, or social group by focusing on the objective reasons of its formation. Historians have used prosopography since the late 19th century to compensate for the incomplete nature of primary sources. Initially limited to ancient history, prosopography has since been extended to all historical periods and has moved beyond the political sphere to increasingly moved into the field of social history. I'm not going to give you examples of the fields it has been used, but you can look it up. It's used more and more in different fields of social history. I would like now to focus on the population of color of South Carolina, free and enslaved, look at the sources and see the extent to which this method could be applied to this population. On the eve of the Civil War, South Carolina had a black majority population with over 400,000 enslaved individuals and a little under 10,000 free people of color. Between 1790 and 1865, the districts of Charleston, South Carolina's economic capital, concentrated approximately 40% of the state's free population of color. Now, I should add that 75% of that free population of color was identified as being mulatto, okay? Despite their free legal status, individuals of African descent, who came to be commonly referred to as free persons of color, faced extensive racial discrimination in South Carolina. Just as enslaved individuals, free persons of color could not testify against whites and were tried without a jury. Upon conviction, both groups could receive corporal punishments and were incarcerated in the city's workhouse. South Carolina imposed a $2 capitation tax on every free person of African descent aged 16 to 50. Non-payments of these taxes could result in their temporary enslavement. Free persons of color were limited in their spatial mobility. After 1794, South Carolina prohibited free people of color from immigrating into the state under the penalty of being enslaved. After 1820, they couldn't leave the states and return. In the wake of the Denmark v.C. 1822 insurrection, slave conspiracy, failed conspiracy, free males of African descent were required to have a white guardian or risk enslavement. So as you can see, by and large, free people of color were placed in a subordinate social position due to their racial affiliation with the enslaved population. Despite these legal disabilities, free people of color, however, enjoyed certain rights that placed them in a superior social status compared to the enslaved population. Like white citizens, free people of color fulfilled militia and patrol duty, but they were limited to serve as musicians, pioneers, or laborers. Free people of color could sue both slaves and other free people of color. However, they could not file a lawsuit against a white person without the assistance of their guardian who acted as their legal representative. Despite being denied the right to vote, free people of color could petition the General Assembly for redress of grievances. Additionally, they were allowed to own property, which allowed them to legally contract with other free people of color and with whites, of course not with slaves, who were not allowed to own property. Marriages of free people of color were considered lawful, and they could pass on property to their descendants. Free persons of color could also take advantage of their economic rights, and they would eventually try to acquire as much property as they could, as it would protect them, and some even acquired enslaved people, and sometimes for commercial reasons. In some instances, they did so to protect their relatives, but you also had instances of slaveholding by free people of color. Now, why did I insist so much on free people of color population and their rights? Because as you understand, in comparison with the enslaved population, the free population of the free people of color enjoyed more legal rights and therefore left more historical traces than the enslaved population, okay? Which is a challenge that we have to take into account when we look at a possible study of the free South Carolinian population, free and enslaved, if we were to undertake a sort of global study using prosopography. Now, looking at this slide, I'm not going to read all the primary sources that that you can see on the slide, okay? Numerous sources document the presence of people of color, whether enslaved or free, in South Carolina. Therefore, it would seem that studying that population would be easy. In reality, the population is and was relatively poorly documented. The reason for this is simply linked to the content of the sources and the fragmented nature of the sources. Indeed, the source material is incomplete and contains certain biases. What do I mean? In South Carolina, as in other slave states, the availability of archival records is inversely proportional to the demographic importance of the African American population in terms of its legal status, free or enslaved, as we saw, gender, male or female, social class, well-off or destitute, and age group, old or young. Indeed, a minority of free individuals of color from the higher social echelons are disproportionately overrepresented in the source materials at the archival expense, if you will, of the overwhelming majority of the population of Black descent, enslaved or free. Although women made up the majority of Charleston's and South Carolina's free Black population, their visibility in the sources is comparatively more limited than that of their male counterparts and harder to trace longitudinally. There are two reasons for this. Free women of color were economically less well-off than their male counterparts, and also identifying them in the sources is made more challenging, more difficult, due to the fact that their surnames changed when they got married. A significant part of South Carolina's free population of color is not documented due to its youth. Starting in 1820, private manumissions were prohibited without the consent of the state's assembly. Consequently, the increase in the free population of color was limited, by law, and was now primarily the result of natural growth. As a result, the free African American population was predominantly young and left, therefore, less historical traces, because the younger you are, the less legal contracts you engage in, so on and so forth, married, so you understand the logic here. Another factor that hinders the study of the enslaved and free population of color over time is the uneven distribution of records throughout the historical period, which saw the emergence and abolition of racial slavery. Although the census improved its data collection methods after 1850, and the print revolution led to the publication of more documents, the sources available for the period The sources available for the period prior to 1840 are scarcer and oftentimes more imprecise. Starting in 1790, the first census provided information on the total population of free people of color and on the enslaved population. However, it was not until 1820 that the census began to differentiate between the sexes of free people of color. Moreover, the decennial censuses did not include age categories for the enslaved and free population of color until 1820. The three households that you see highlighted in red on the slide here, illustrate the limitations of the first federal census to provide meaningful information on the population of color compared to the white one. Arnoldus Vanderhoost, who was then the intendant, that is the mayor of Charleston, and who later served as the governor of South Carolina, headed a household with 8 white individuals, 2 males aged 16 and over, 1 white male under 16, and 5 white females whose age is not indicated. Additionally, as you can see, the Vanderhoost household included a free person of non-white descent who could have been of African or Native American descent, as well as 11 enslaved individuals. However, the census does not provide any information on the age nor on the gender of the non-white individuals. In a similar fashion, we can learn from the census that John Beale was white, older than 16, and at the head of a household that included 2 free individuals of color and 10 enslaved people whose age and sex we cannot determine by looking at these documents. Finally, the household of John, I think, is very telling, interesting to look at. So John, a free man of color, exemplifies how primary sources confirm the historical and archival marginalization of people of color. John, in all likelihood, had been recently manumitted, as indicated by the lack of a surname in the record. He headed a household of 7 non-white individuals whose age and gender, once again, we cannot definitely determine. So, identifying members of a household prior to 1850 is very complex, was and is still very complex. It requires a lot of source cross-referencing, which can be both time-consuming and sometimes impossible given the lack of available source material. As we saw earlier, the absence of a surname can make it very challenging to track individuals of color in historical records over several decades due to the absence of a referential stability over time to track that individual in the sources. In both 1850 and 1860, the United States Federal Census recorded enslaved individuals in Population Schedule 2. Slave schedules indicated the age of the enslaved person, the sex, and the color, that is the degree of racial admixture, as well as any disabilities that the enslaved individuals may have had. The census, as you can see, does not provide the names of the enslaved individuals, but instead numbers them, ordering them from the oldest to the youngest. So this is another challenge. Given the limitations of the archives, it's obvious that focusing on individual destinies over time introduces a social and a gender bias. Only well-established families of free people of color with stable surnames would recurrently appear in multiple sources over decades, thus providing researchers with more available data to work with. However, by primarily recounting the experiences of a minority of comparatively well-to-do individuals, the elite, we end up reversing to writing history that overlooks the life experiences of the anonymous masses. Using aggregate data could help address disparities in source distribution and provide material for quantitative analysis. However, this method also risks to further anonymize underrepresented historical figures. So, in recent years, scholars have tackled the challenge of the lack of sources on enslaved and Black individuals in slave societies by suggesting to step beyond the traditional archives in a more creative way. And this is what Amanda was referring to during her presentation. Marisa Fuentes' book, Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive, examines archival politics specifically regarding the underrepresentation of enslaved women. Edward Baptiste, responding to criticism of his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, advocated for the use of evocative history that creatively fills historical gaps. Similarly, in The Matter of Nat Turner, Speculative History, Christopher Tomlins, in his 2020 book, engages in conjecture, due to the lack of empirical evidence on Nat Turner. Obviously, my talk today has raised more questions than it has provided answers. There is unfortunately no easy solution to tackle the issue of how little the fragmentary archives reveal about the free, the enslaved, and the enslaved African American population taken as a whole. Despite the challenges involved, the uneven distribution of sources can be, I believe, mitigated to some extent by employing a collective biography approach. A flexible method that would gather data inclusively, allowing for both quantitative and qualitative analysis, seems to be a good direction to head to. This is what Sebastian is doing in his research with Olivier Esteves. So building maybe a comprehensive database from multiple sources, many of which are handwritten, you understand, requires a collaborative effort, funding, sometimes IT expertise, and it would prove costly and time-consuming, But it can be done, as exemplified by the numerous databases, data sets that are today, that feature on the website, enslaved.org. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I don't know if I'm going to, I still have 2 minutes, so I'm just going to describe a few of the projects, and maybe you can look it up this evening. So basically, enslaved.org is an open access, interactive, and searchable repository of databases that focuses on collecting data on enslaved peoples and the historical slave trade. It currently hosts 28 databases offering a diverse range of information on more than 600,000 enslaved and free people of color, as well as enslavers. So as you can see, the website offers the possibility to enter information, a name, an age, a geographical area, in order to sort of identify an individual in the sources. And the advantage of the website is that it has interconnected, linked the 28 databases, which is something, I mean, quite remarkable. Okay, so as you can see, the difference with the advanced search feature, all the types of research that you could undertake. So I'm not going to describe the different data sets that I had sort of pre-selected to describe, but you can see that you have information concerning slave sales, slave hires. This information allows you to retrace the ethnicity, origin, age, price that was paid for the enslaved population whenever it was possible. So this is the Louisiana slave database that contains over 100,000 names, which was compiled by the historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. Okay, she was really a precursor in this type of data collection. Okay, so this is the slave voyages. So all these data sets were curated by very well-known historians. I'm not going to, I don't have enough time, but I really invite you to go and use this website. The website also contains information, as you can see, about the free population of color of certain cities. So here we have New Orleans and Natchez too, okay? Now, just to conclude, the Enslaved.org project seeks to recover the lives of enslaved people. The initiative, okay, engages in reparative scholarship and social justice through the archive, that is trying to recover the lives of those that do not appear in the sources, okay? Such an initiative is sort of exemplified by the data set that is called They Had Names. Okay, they had names. You see this importance of saying that the enslaved people were not only objectified chattel property, but they had names. And this data set aims at helping African Americans in their genealogical search, for their ancestors who once resided in Liberty County, Georgia, and whose names have not been indexed or omitted from digitized online records. Building these databases has a cost, and I'll just conclude with this point, okay? Enslaved.org received $1.5 million, among many other different forms of funding, from the Mellon Foundation. However, as exemplified by this last data sets, researchers with more modest means have nevertheless contributed their data sets to enslaved.org, which is housed free of charge in the Harvard Dataverse. Okay, so if you feel like creating one of these data sets, you can submit them to the enslaved.org. But just to conclude and to illustrate what it would, the collection process entails and what it would cost in times, financially and in terms of your time, I'll briefly conclude by showing you this slide that describes how the data was gathered, okay, in the They Had the Name project. Kathy Dillon, a member of the team of two who compiled the data, is described in the following terms and having worked at the following pace. So I'll just read this. Kathy Dillon is a retired federal civil servant who volunteered to transcribe for the site starting in May 2019, and she dedicated parts of each day to adding names to the database between 2019 and 2022. She completed the Liberty County Estate Inventories from 1790 to 1865, containing more than 13,314 names of enslaved African Americans, and she transcribed the majority of the Southern Claims Commission case files found on the site. So this shows you the scope of the work it involves to partially retrieve the pieces of the lives of the historically invisibilized in the archives. Thank you for your patience.